When did you first learn about the Rosewood Massacre?
Probably when I was in graduate school, which was in the 80s, as it just was beginning to come out, with Moore's article in the St. Pete Times, and maybe the early 90s then when David Colburn, who was working with me, became part of that group that was tasked to give the report on Rosewood to the legislature. But I lived here since the 70s and didn't know much about what had happened. Well, first of all, people's knowledge of history in general is pretty low, and people's understanding of Florida history is probably even less because most people are not native Floridians. And people have selective memory about race and bad things because this is a really bad thing, and so you don't want to talk about it. And also, when you talk about racial issues and racial problems, they don't happen in Florida because Florida is not part of the South. They happen in Alabama, they happen in Mississippi, they happen maybe in Georgia, but not in Florida. And so when word of this comes out that Florida is as bad as any other place in the South, because Florida is the South, people are shocked and amazed. Before you get to the week, you have to put it in context. Florida's in the midst of Jim Crow, and it's at its low point at this point. First 2 and 3 decades of the 20th century are the low point of race relations in the South. Rebirth of the Klan, birth of a nation, the movie comes out, reinvigorating white supremacy. Whites are angry because the Great Migration has taken place and their cheap labor is moving to the north. We hate these people, we don't want them, they rape our women, they're awful people, but if they move, we're pissed off because we need them for cheap labor. So it's that interesting dichotomy. And World War I takes place, in which African American soldiers fight and die for America. They come back and they pretty quickly make the assumption or the connection between fighting for democracy overseas and the fact that they are second-class citizens here at home. So African American soldiers are much less willing to defer to white supremacy after the war than they were before the war. So all these things put together show us that those first 5 years after the war are pretty racially tense throughout the nation. There's the horrific race riot, as it's called, or more like massacre in Tulsa, which takes place, and the Gatewood neighborhood is burned to the ground in a similar situation to Rosewood, although I think it's significantly larger and more important because it is the Black Wall Street, as it's called. So Rosewood is in the context of what's going on region-wide in the South. It's also in the context of what's going on in Florida, and people have been lynched in Perry close to when the Rosewood incident happens. There's a big Klan rally in Gainesville close to when the Rosewood incident happens. So there's tension around, and certainly the tension is exacerbated by the claims of Fannie Taylor that she is raped by a black man in early January 1923. And there's 3 stories. One, that the right story, that she is raped by a black man, and assumedly this guy who escapes from a chain gang, and that he rapes her and then beats her and then he leaves. That's the story that sets the stage for what happens in Rosewood. Then there's the story within the black community that she has a white lover who attacks her and beats her while her husband is at work. And then there's another story that I heard that it is her husband himself who beats her, and he comes home from work early. He's supposed to be on the job at the lumber mill, but he comes home and she doesn't do her wifely duties, so he beats her. So there's all these stories. Obviously there's no evidence at all of rape because there was no DNA, there's no testing, so we just have her story. Certainly we have the bruises on her that she was beaten, so we know that, but we don't know whether she was violated, as it were. And this is in the town of Sumner, which is the all-white parallel community to Rosewood. Sumner's where the lumber mill is, and I think, when you talk about interesting stuff, the lumber mill is the Cummer Lumber Mill, and if you go to Jacksonville, you'll know that the art museum is the Cummer Museum of Art, which is funded philanthropically by these people, so there's an interesting connection there. So Fannie Taylor, and I tell this to my students, and Fannie, she's like 20 years old, 21, so she's their age, she's the age of these students, married, and apparently violated. We have to, as good white men, we have to avenge this. We go looking for the guy. We assume the guy is being protected in the black community of Rosewood. We go in there. We find a guy, Sam Carter, who we assume has something to do with this. We torture him, we kill him, we shoot him, we hang him from a tree as a sign that, this is what you do when you don't give us the answers we want. And then we go into the town of Rosewood. And, the town of Rosewood is a all-black community, very similar to Eatonville down in Central Florida. And, by all accounts, it's a fairly thriving, prosperous community. And here's when you get into what Rosewood was. There are people who maintain that it is just, that it is a thriving, wonderful community where everything is great, and at some level, the John Singleton movie. Have you guys seen that? Yeah. Which, it portrays Rosewood as 1950s white America. This wonderful middle class, and I think that's probably overstating the case a little bit. On the other hand, these are proud black people who, in the midst of Jim Crow, have managed to develop a community of which they own their own houses, they have their own churches, they have their Masonic Hall, and the Carrier House. I mean, and I tell my students this all the time, the Carrier House has the accoutrements of middle class respectability. They have a parlor, and in that parlor they got the thing that exemplifies middle class respectability in America. That's a piano. If you have a piano, you've made it. And Carrier, interestingly enough, he's this proud black guy who doesn't take any nonsense from white people, but he's a music teacher too. So he's got this interesting combination. So what happens is they go to the Carrier House, these white guys, and it's led by sort of officials from Levy County. So this is not just some crazy ass mob. It's an organized group, and they look for the alleged perpetrator who is being hidden by these black people in Rosewood. And gunfire takes place. They kick down the door, and Sylvester Carrier is armed, and he shoots and kills two of these white guys. Both of whom are employees of the Cummer Mill. And of course they're supervisors. And they retreat, and black people are killed in the house. Sarah Carrier, I think, is killed in the house. So it's a gun battle. But as the whites retreat, taking their dead and wounded with them, now the assumption is not only do we have black people who are hiding not an alleged, but a rapist, we have black people with guns who've killed white people, which is unacceptable in the early 20th century South. And they come back with a mob from all throughout the state, and there's stories of cars coming from Jacksonville and South Central Florida and especially Gainesville. And these guys come here and they just burn the town down. They find a black guy on the side of the road, and apparently he doesn't give them the right answer. They just shoot him, and so Rosewood is burned to the ground and destroyed. African Americans flee, and oftentimes they flee into the swamps around Rosewood. And if you've been there, you know how the Waukesasa River, all this stuff. It's pretty wild terrain out there. And so when we take our students out there, the theme of the week for high school students is water. And we tend to think of water as something we drink and use for agriculture, but here water is an escape, and we show them the well. I don't know if you've been out to the Wright House. There's a well there, and they hid in the well, so there's that water thing. So we play on that water theme. So they escape by foot oftentimes and hide out in the swamps until it's clear to go, and then they disperse. Also, some of them are saved by beneficent whites, the Bryce brothers who run the train, and they put them on and certainly that's kind of the penultimate scene in the John Singleton movie, where they get on the train and they take him back to Gainesville, and the town is destroyed. And it's big news in the papers all over the nation, and then 4 days, it's forgotten. It's yesterday's news. It's just like everything else. We tend to think of today's papers as having a short attention span. Certainly, there's a short attention span there too. But African American papers, particularly the Chicago Defender, which is really more of a national paper than a Chicago paper, keeps up the drumbeat of that this is just typical of what's going on in the South. And the governor doesn't do much. A grand jury is impaneled. They come up with the usual stuff. Oh, bad things happen. We don't know who did it. So,
why weren't any white people prosecuted on that?
It's the South. It's the South in 1920. They're not going to prosecute any white people. I mean, it becomes a default answer in my Florida history class when we talk about lynching. And I say, okay, well, what did the grand jury determine? And as a class, they all respond, death caused by persons unknown. They're not going to do that. The notion of Black Lives Matter is in the death toll. Official death toll is 8. 6 blacks, 2 whites. That is incredibly contested number. Numbers range up to 27, and I've heard people say up to 100. And well, if that's the case, where's the evidence for this? Well, there's a mass grave somewhere, and historians have looked for this and haven't found it, and therefore say it doesn't exist. But within the oral tradition of the survivors who don't talk about this, but now once it's out, say they're there. We don't know who they are, their names or anything else, but that doesn't mean that that this didn't happen. Black people are not willing to talk about this stuff because still Jim Crow's in place in the South till the 50s, till the 60s. Legalized segregation, and some places till the 70s. I mean, Gainesville doesn't desegregate their school till 1970, for God's sake. So you're going to bring this up? I don't think so. So, it's finally brought out of the shadows in the 80s, and people begin to talk about it. And it's a rather propitious moment in Florida when there are still progressives in the government who are pushing for us to document what happened. And how do we do that? We document it with historians. And so historians from UF and FSU and FAMU collaborate on this story, and they interview people for the first time, whites and blacks, and compile this document. I don't know if you guys seen this document. It's pretty big, and it's got all sorts of interviews and everything else. And it goes national. It gets on, the St. Pete Times publishes stuff, and then it goes. Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes, and I think it's important. They don't bring in Leslie Stahl or Mike Wallace. They bring in Ed Bradley, the black guy, and he talks to these people, and it's a time in which Americans are willing to talk about this stuff. And the legislature amazingly agrees to reparation. Well, they don't use that term. They do not use that term, but it is reparations. I think it's supposed to be $7 million. The bill said $2 million. It turns out $1.5 million goes to descendants or survivors of Rosewood. And then, of course, we got to figure out who's a descendant. And people get angry. Oh, you weren't there. Oh, you were there, but just for a minute, So people, and so there's fighting even within the black community over this, and it's my story, not your story. It's your story, not my story. Good people simply, A, chose to ignore, or B, weren't told. The generation growing up in the 60s and 70s, white or black, doesn't know anything about this. And so if you don't learn about it in school, if you don't read about it in books, it's not in Florida textbooks, how would you know? How would you know? And the only way you know is through oral history, and the repression of memory within the black community is pretty amazing.